The water tasted wrong 3 weeks before anyone said the word aloud. Jorik Ven knew it first in the morning ablutions, the ritual cleansing before his shift at the third-level manufactorum, where he'd spent 27 years assembling bolt, rifle, trigger mechanisms. The water from the communal spigot carried a copper tang that hadn't been there before, and beneath that, something else, something that made his throat close and his stomach churn. He said nothing. In the lower habs of Tertius Prime, you learned early that complaints were prayers offered to deaf gods. The silence was worse than the taste. For 6 days the vox casters in the transit tunnels had broadcast nothing but hymnal static. The daily quotas, the production announcements, the prayer schedules that marked time, like a heartbeat across the hive city. All of it had dissolved into white noise, and the occasional burst of something that might have been screaming, might have been laughter. Jorik passed beneath the dead speakers with his head down, his work badge clutched against his chest like a talisman. Around him, tens of thousands did the same. The manufactorum still opened its gates. The shift still changed. The God Emperor's work continued because to stop was to acknowledge that something had changed, and that acknowledgement would make it real. On the 7th day, the overseer didn't arrive. Jorik stood at his assembly station, hands hovering over components that suddenly seemed alien. The trigger mechanism he'd assembled 10,000 times felt wrong in his fingers. The servitors along the conveyor belt continued their jerking motions, their lobotomized brains unable to register the absence of authority. But the human workers had frozen. 26 men and women on his production line, all staring at the empty observation platform, where Overseer Calix should have been standing with his data slate and his shock maul and his voice that could peel paint from plasteel. Maybe he's sick. The voice belonged to Marna Holt, 3 stations down. She was younger than Jorik, still had the optimism that ground out of you after your first decade in the lower habs. Or there's been a reassignment. The administratum as always. The lights went out. Not all at once. That might have been manageable. Might have been explained as a power fluctuation or a scheduled maintenance cycle that someone forgot to announce. Instead, the lumens died in waves, starting at the far end of the manufactorum and rolling toward them like a physical thing. Jorik watched the darkness eat the space around him, swallowing workers and machines and the distant ceiling struts. And in that moment before his own lights failed, he saw something that would live behind his eyes forever. The shadows were moving wrong. They didn't fall where they should have. They stretched and pooled in directions that had nothing to do with the dying light, reaching across workstations like grasping fingers. One of them, he was sure, he was absolutely sure, had eyes. Yellow eyes that burned with a light that wasn't light at all, but the absence of something fundamental, something that his mind tried to categorize as simply wrong, because it had no other frame of reference. Then his section went dark, and he heard Marna start to scream. The emergency lumens kicked in after 17 seconds. Jorik knew because he counted every one of them, his lips moving in silent prayer to the God Emperor, whose attention surely couldn't extend to the 3rd level of a manufactorum on a world whose name probably didn't appear in any records outside the local subsector. The red glow of the emergency system turned everything into a scene from an execution chamber. Marna had stopped screaming, but her hands were pressed against her mouth, and her eyes were too wide, too white. 2 stations down, a man named Heckle that Jorik had worked beside for 9 years was gone. Simply gone. His tools were still on his bench. His work badge still hung from the assembly frame, but Heckle himself had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. "We need to leave." Jorik's voice surprised him with its steadiness. "Now, all of us." "The quota," someone started. "There is no quota." The words felt like heresy even as he spoke them, but Jorik forced himself to continue. "Look at the observation platform. Look at the chronometer. Look at the vox casters. When was the last time you heard an actual order? When was the last time anyone from the upper levels came down here? The chronometer on the far wall had stopped at 17 minutes past the 6th hour. It had been stopped, Jorik realized with a lurch of his stomach, for 3 days. He'd walked past it every shift change and never noticed, because noticing would have required acknowledging that the careful structure of his existence was coming apart. They left in a group, 37 workers abandoning their stations for the first time in their lives without official sanction. The manufactorum stretched around them, level after level of industrial machinery, continuing their work with the mindless persistence of servitors, because the servitors didn't know how to stop. In the red emergency lighting, the moving assembly lines looked like arteries, pulsing with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the Emperor's work and everything to do with something else, something that Jorik's mind shied away from naming. The transit tunnel that should have taken them back to the residential habs was flooded, not with water, with something that looked like water in the dim red light, but moved with a viscosity that was all wrong. That rippled against the flow of air currents and left patterns on the tunnel walls that hurt to look at. Jorik watched a woman named Seta step into it before anyone could stop her, watched her sink to her ankles, and then start to laugh. The sound echoed down the tunnel, getting louder instead of fading, and when Seta turned around, her eyes were the same yellow he'd seen in the shadows. "It's so beautiful," she said, and her voice had harmonics that made Jorik's teeth ache. "Why didn't anyone tell us it was so beautiful? We've been living in such ugliness, such limited, finite ugliness, when all of this was waiting. All we had to do was stop believing in the lie." 3 people moved toward her, whether to pull her back or join her. Jorik never found out, because Marna grabbed his arm and yanked him down a maintenance corridor he'd never noticed before. Behind them, Seta kept talking, her voice rising and falling in a cadence that might have been singing, might have been prayer, but was definitely not human anymore. The maintenance corridor led to a service elevator that shouldn't have been functioning, but was. The control panel sparked and flickered, the runes displaying floor numbers that didn't exist. But when Marna stabbed the button for the upper habs, it lurched into motion. 34 of them crowded into a space meant for 6, pressed so close together that Jorik could feel every rapid heartbeat, every panting breath. The smell of fierce sweat and machine oil was overwhelming. It was also, in a way he couldn't articulate, a comfort. These were human smells, real smells, proof that whatever was happening, they were still themselves. The elevator climbed for what felt like hours. The floor counterspun through numbers that made no sense, sometimes going backwards, sometimes jumping ahead by dozens of levels. Through the mesh of the elevator cage, Jorik caught glimpses of the hive city passing by, and each glimpse was worse than the last. A residential level, where every door hung open and something red and wet covered the walls in patterns that might have been writing. A market district where the stalls were still set up, but the vendors had been replaced by things that wore their skin, like coats that didn't quite fit. A chapel where the aquila had been inverted and the altar, "O God Emperor, the altar," was occupied by a priest who was simultaneously screaming in agony and laughing in ecstasy while his congregation did things to themselves that Jorik's mind refused to process. When the elevator finally shuddered to a halt, they spilled out into a hab level that Jorik recognized. Level 87, middle residential, where he'd grown up and where his sister still lived with her husband and 3 children. The corridor looked normal, well lit. The Vox caster in the ceiling was broadcasting the evening prayer cycle in a voice that was calm and measured and absolutely standard. It was the most terrifying thing he'd seen yet. "This isn't right," Marna whispered. "Why is it normal here?" Jorik didn't answer. He was already running toward his sister's hab unit, his work boots echoing on the metal deck plating. The door was unlocked. Inside, Helena was setting the table for the evening meal. Her husband, Marcus, was helping their oldest son with his catechism lessons. The youngest two were playing with small metal toys in the corner, making the noises children make when they're pretending the emperor's soldiers are destroying the enemies of mankind. Jorik. Helena looked up with a smile that was exactly the same smile she'd worn every time he'd visited for the past 10 years. You're early. Did your shift end already? Helena. He grabbed her shoulders, felt how fragile they were under his hands. One need to leave. Now. All of you. Something is happening in the lower levels. Something terrible. And it's spreading. Leave. Her smile didn't waver. But it's almost time for evening prayers. We can't miss evening prayers. Did you hear me? There are things down there, things in the water and the shadow's end. You sound stressed. Brother. Marcus had stood up from the catechism table. His voice was gentle, concerned, exactly how Marcus always sounded. Perhaps you should sit down. Have you been drinking enough water? Dehydration can cause all sorts of problems. Jorik's mouth went dry. What did you say? I said you should drink more water. It's important to stay hydrated. Marcus moved to the kitchen alcove and filled a cup from the tap. The water was clear, clean. It didn't have the copper tang or the other thing, the thing that Jorik still couldn't name. Marcus held it out with both hands, like an offering at a shrine. Here, you'll feel better. What's in the water, Marcus? Water. The smile on Marcus's face was Helena's smile. Was everyone's smile. Just water, pure and clean, and provided by the grace of the administratum. We're very lucky, you know. Some worlds don't have clean water. Some worlds have to fight for every drop. But not us. We're blessed. All we have to do is drink. Jorik backed toward the door. Behind Marcus, he could see that Helena hadn't moved. Neither had the children. They were all frozen in their activities, like servitors waiting for an activation command. Only their eyes moved, tracking him with an attention that was too focused, too hungry. Drink, Helena said, and her voice had the same harmonics as Seta's had down in the tunnel. It's so beautiful once you drink. You'll understand everything. You'll see why we were so limited before, why the Emperor kept us so small and finite when infinity was always waiting. Just drink. He ran. Behind him, he heard the HAB unit door open and the sound of footsteps. Not running footsteps, walking footsteps. Measured and calm and absolutely certain. They knew he'd have to stop eventually. They knew he'd get thirsty eventually. They knew that in a hive city of 17 million souls, there was nowhere to go that the water hadn't already reached. The others from the manufactorum were scattered through the corridor, each of them having run to their own homes, their own families. Jorik passed 3 of them in the next 5 minutes, and each one was stumbling back out of their HAB units with the same expression of horror and disbelief. Marna was crying, her hands pressed against her stomach like she was trying to hold herself together. An older man named Drem was on his knees, vomiting onto the deck plating, his shoulders heaving with sobs that sounded like prayers. My wife. Drem managed between heaves. My sons. They're all, oh God Emperor, they're all. The Vox casters crackled. For a moment there was just static. And in that static Jorik could hear things that might have been voices, or might have been the sound of reality tearing. Then a voice emerged, clear and calm, and absolutely authoritative. Citizens of Tertius Prime. This is Governor Maltheus speaking. There is no cause for alarm. The recent fluctuations in power and communications have been resolved. The Emperor protects, and through his divine providence we have weathered this minor disturbance. All citizens are instructed to return to their domiciles and await further instructions. Evening prayers will be conducted as scheduled. Compliance is mandatory. The Emperor protects. The message repeated 3 times, then dissolved back into static. That wasn't the governor. Marna had stopped crying, but her voice was hollow, scraped clean of everything but certainty. The governor's voice is higher, and he always says, the God Emperor protects, not just the Emperor protects. I've heard him on the Vox 100 times. That wasn't him. Then who was it? Drem had struggled to his feet, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Does it matter? Jorik was already moving again, pulling them along. We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere away from the water, away from the vox casters, away from... The lights went out again. All of them this time, not in waves, but in a single instant of transition from illumination to absolute darkness. Jorik heard Marna gasp beside him, heard Drem start to pray in a rapid whisper that was more panic than devotion. Around them, through the darkness, came the sound of hab unit doors opening. Dozens of them. Hundreds. The steady click, click, click of magnetic locks disengaging in sequence, and then the soft pad of bare feet on deck plating. When the emergency lumens kicked in, the corridor was full of people. They stood in their doorways or just outside them, every resident of level 87 visible at once. Men, women, children, elderly, infirm, they were all there, all standing, all staring at Jorik and his small group with the same expression of patient expectation. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. They just watched with eyes that reflected the red emergency lighting like animals caught in a spotlight. Then, as one, they smiled. "The Emperor protects," they said in perfect unison, their voices creating a harmony that shouldn't have been possible from human throats. "And we are his faithful servants. Why do you run from his blessing? Why do you refuse his gift?" Jorik ran. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just turned and sprinted down the corridor with Morna and Drem close behind. The unified mass of residents didn't chase them. They didn't need to. The Hive City was 17 levels of interconnected corridors and transit tunnels and service shafts. And every one of them was filled with people who had drunk the water. People who had stopped being entirely human while retaining enough of their original shape to be recognizable. People who moved with purpose now, who were coordinating in ways that the isolated, grinding existence of the lower habs had never permitted. They found refuge in a maintenance shaft that led to the exterior wall of the hive. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for Jorik's shoulders, and it climbed at a steep angle that made his legs burn after the first 100 meters. But it was dry. The walls were rough plasteel and corroded metal. No pipes, no plumbing, no possible source of water. They climbed until they couldn't climb anymore, until their hands were bleeding and their lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. And then they collapsed on a service platform that overlooked the outside world. Jorik had never seen the outside before. He'd been born in the lower habs, had spent his entire life breathing recycled air and walking on metal floors, and seeing only the artificial lights of the manufactorum. The concept of outside was something from children's tales, stories about ancient times before humanity had built its great hives and learned to shield itself from the hostility of the universe. He'd known, intellectually, that the hive city had an exterior, but knowing and seeing were different things. The sky was wrong. It wasn't black, as he'd expected. It wasn't even the deep purple that some of the older workers described. When they told stories about the rare occasions, they'd glimpsed the firmament. It was a color that Jorik's mind struggled to process, something between green and violet, but also neither. Something that seemed to shift when he looked at it directly. And in that sky, instead of stars, there were shapes. Vast geometric forms that rotated slowly, their edges cutting through reality like blades through flesh. Where they turned, the air itself seemed to scream. "The warp," Marna whispered. "That's the warp. Tertius Prime's gellar fields have failed. The warp is bleeding through." Jorik didn't ask how she knew. Some knowledge was intrinsic, hard-coded into the genetic memory of humanity. After 10,000 years of fighting the same enemy, you could spend your whole life never hearing the word daemon spoken aloud, never learning the truth of what lurked beyond the veil of reality, and still know it when you saw it. Still feel your soul recoil from the fundamental wrongness of it. How long? Drem's voice was steady now, calm, with the acceptance of someone who had already moved past fear into the territory beyond it. How long do we have before it reaches us here? It already has. Jorik pointed down at the hive city spreading below them. From this height, he could see the full extent of Tertius Prime, 17 million souls packed into a structure that rose from the polluted earth like a man-made mountain. And in the windows of that structure, in thousands upon thousands of hab units and administratum offices and chapel spaces, lights were moving. Not the steady glow of lumens, not the flicker of candles. Lights that pulsed and writhed, that changed color in sequences that hurt to watch. And in those lights, silhouettes were dancing. They're celebrating, Marna said. They think they've been freed. Have they? The question came from somewhere deep in Jorik's chest, somewhere he hadn't known existed until this moment. Were we the ones in prison? Were we the ones living in chains while the warp, don't? Marna's hand on his arm was bruising in its intensity. Don't even think it. That's how it starts. That's how they get in. Not through the water, not really. The water is just a vector. They get in through doubt, through the moment you start to question whether the Emperor's truth is really truth, whether the Imperium is really protecting us or imprisoning us, whether the alternative might be. She stopped, her eyes going wide. Her hand fell away from Jorik's arm, and she took a step back, then another. Oh, she said softly. Oh no, I can taste it. I can taste the copper. When did we? There was water in the elevator, wasn't there? Condensation on the walls. I touched it. I licked my lips. Marna. Jorik reached for her, but she jerked away. Don't touch me. It's in me now. I can feel it spreading, getting into everything. And Jorik, they were right. They were right about how beautiful it is. I can see things I never could before. The universe isn't what they told us. It's so much bigger, so much more alive, and all we have to do is let go. Just let go of all the fear and the pain and the grinding existence. And she jumped. One moment she was standing on the service platform, her face twisted in a mixture of ecstasy and horror. And the next she was gone, dropping away into the polluted air currents that swirled around the hive exterior. Jorik lunged forward, but Drem caught him, pulled him back from the edge. They stood together in silence, watching until Marna's falling shape disappeared into the toxic fog that shrouded the hive's lower levels. How much time do you think we have? Drem asked after a long minute. I don't know. Hours. Days. Jorik sank down against the wall of the service shaft, his legs finally giving out. Does it matter? Yes. Drem sat beside him, his weathered face still calm, still composed. Because dying as myself matters. Dying human matters. Whatever time we have left before the water, or the voices, or the whatever it is reaches us, that time is ours. We get to choose how we spend it. That's more than most people in this hive will get. They sat together as the twisted sky rotated overhead and the city below them descended further into madness. The Vox casters had given up any pretense of normalcy now. From inside the hive came sounds that might have been singing, might have been screaming, might have been the death rattle of 17 million souls being consumed by something that had been waiting just beyond the edge of reality for 10,000 years. Waiting for the moment when belief faltered, when the Geller fields failed, when the God Emperor's attention turned elsewhere and left a world vulnerable. Do you think help will come? Jorik asked. The Imperium? Drem laughed, but there was no humor in it. We're one world among millions, a manufactorum planet whose only value is the bolt rifle components we ship out twice a year. If the astropathic relay survived long enough to send a distress signal, and if that signal reached someone who cared, and if the Imperium deemed us worth saving, then yes, help might come, in 6 months, a year, 5 years. And if we're still alive then they'll purge us anyway. Everyone who's drunk the water, everyone who's been exposed to the warp, everyone who's seen what we've seen, contaminated, tainted. Better to burn the whole world clean and start over than risk a single corrupted soul spreading the infection. Drem's voice was matter of fact, neither bitter nor resigned, simply stating truth as he understood it. That's how the Imperium survives, Jorik. Not through mercy. Through absolute, unwavering brutality when it comes to the warp. Then what was the point? Jorik heard his voice rising, felt something breaking loose in his chest that might have been hysteria or rage or simple exhaustion. What was the point of any of it? 40 years I've been alive. 40 years of work and prayer and obedience. 27 years at the same assembly station, making the same component over and over and over. Never complaining, never questioning, believing that I was serving the Emperor. That my life had meaning because I was part of something larger. And now it's all gone. Everything. The hive, the Imperium, the Emperor's protection. All of it just evaporated because something in the water changed. So, what was the point? The point, Drem said quietly, was that you were human. You lived a human life with human dignity, serving a human purpose. Not an easy life. Not a life with joy or comfort, or any of the things the ancient texts say people used to have, but a human life. And now, at the end, you get to die a human death. Not transformed, not corrupted, not made into something else. That's the point, Jorik. In a universe where things exist that can strip away everything that makes you yourself, dying as yourself is victory. The words settled over Jorik like a shroud, heavy but not uncomfortable. He thought about the trigger mechanism again, about the satisfaction of assembly, the click of components fitting together. Such a small thing, such a meaningless contribution to a war machine that stretched across the galaxy. But it had been his skill, his work, his proof of existence. I'm thirsty, he said after a while. I know, really thirsty. My throat feels like I've been swallowing rust. How long has it been since we drank anything clean? 12 hours. Maybe 15. Drem's voice was rough too, cracked at the edges. The body can survive 3 days without water. We've got time yet. Time for what? To decide how we want to spend it. Jorik looked out at the corrupted sky, at the geometric shapes that hurt his eyes, at the city below writhing with transformed humanity. The cold air on the service platform bit into his skin, turning his exposed hands numb. The metal beneath him was unforgiving, pressing into his bones. Every breath tasted of chemicals and corruption. Every moment was a fresh assault of discomfort. And yet, it was his moment, his discomfort, his choice to sit here in the cold rather than descend back into the warmth of the hive where the water waited. Tell me about your family, Jorik said. Before all this, Drem was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried decades of memory compressed into simple words. I had 3 sons. Marcus, Darren, Victus. Good boys. Strong. They all went into the manufactorums like their father, like their grandfather. Marcus worked munitions assembly on level 50. Darren was in the Promethium refineries. Victus, the youngest, he was a quality inspector for las gunpowder packs. Good work. Important work. Saw them down in the corridor when we ran from your sister's hab. They were among the ones standing in the doorways, smiling. All 3 of them. And my wife Senna, she was there too. Standing between Darren and Victus like she was presenting them, like she was proud. Drem's voice didn't crack, didn't waver. I knew them by their faces, by the scars Marcus got from a cooling accident. By the way, Darren always stood with his weight on his left leg because his right knee never healed properly from a fall. By Victus's crooked nose. But they weren't them anymore, just things wearing their shapes. I'm sorry. Don't be. They lived good lives. 43 years for Marcus. 40 for Darren. 37 for Victus. They worked hard. They provided for their families. They died human. Even if something else is walking around in their bodies now. That's more than a lot of people get. Jorik thought about Helna's children, about the way they'd frozen mid-play, toys still clutched in their small hands. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10. The youngest was maybe 5. They'd barely had lives at all before the corruption took them. Did they have a choice? He asked. The children, I mean. They're too young to understand, too young to resist. If they drank the water because they were told to, because they trusted the adults around them, is that really corruption? Or is it just murder? Drem turned to look at him, and in the red light of the emergency lumens his face was ancient, carved from stone. Does it matter? Dead is dead. Corrupted is corrupted. The Imperium won't distinguish between willing and unwilling participants. When the purge comes, they'll burn the children same as the adults. Burn them because it's the only way to be sure, because mercy is a luxury humanity can't afford when dealing with the warp. That's monstrous.
Yes.
Drem's agreement was simple. Absolute. It is. The Imperium is monstrous. Has to be. Because the alternative, the thing we're fighting, is worse. You've seen it now. Seen what happens when the warp gets through. 17 million people transformed into something that thinks it's better, thinks it's been freed, but is really just a puppet for forces that exist beyond human comprehension. You want to know the real horror? Jorik. It's that they're probably right. Probably are experiencing something more vivid, more intense, more connected than anything we've ever felt. But it's not them experiencing it. It's something else. Using their neurons to process sensations that human brains were never meant to handle. They're gone. What's left is just an echo, a recording, a ghost in a machine that used to be human. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of the corrupted hive. Jorik couldn't identify the specific components of that smell, but his body recognized it on some primal level. His stomach churned, his skin crawled. Every instinct screamed at him to move away from the source, to find clean air, to escape. But there was nowhere to escape to. I keep thinking about the assembly line, Jorik said, about how the components had to fit together just right, or the whole mechanism would fail. Every piece had a specific role, a specific shape. You couldn't just swap them out or force them into configurations they weren't designed for. The system only worked because each piece maintained its integrity, its specific function. You think humanity is like that, a machine where every piece has to maintain its shape? Maybe. The Imperium certainly treats us that way. Everyone in their place, doing their assigned task, never questioning, never deviating. It's brutal and it's grinding, and it destroys anything that doesn't fit the template. But maybe that's what survival looks like on a galactic scale. Maybe flexibility is a luxury species can afford when they're not fighting for existence against things that can unmake reality itself. Or maybe, Drem said slowly, the Imperium is just as much a prison as what the warp is offering. Maybe we're caught between two different kinds of slavery, and neither one actually cares about us as individuals. The warp wants to dissolve us into some kind of collective consciousness. The Imperium wants to grind us down into interchangeable cogs. Either way, Jorik Ven the person, Drem Coulter the person, we don't matter. We're just resources to be used up. Then why resist? Why die for a system that treats us as disposable? Because the alternative is worse. Because at least the Imperium leaves us ourselves while it uses us. Brutal, limited, suffering selves, but selves nonetheless. The warp promises transcendence, but delivers annihilation. I'd rather be a miserable cog that knows it's miserable than a transformed thing that doesn't even remember it used to be something different. Hours passed. The cold deepened. Jorik's thirst grew from uncomfortable to painful to agonizing. His tongue felt swollen in his mouth, his throat raw. When he tried to swallow, it felt like grinding metal on metal. Beside him, Drem had grown quiet, conserving his energy, his breathing shallow and measured. The city below continued its transformation. The lights in the windows had synchronized now, pulsing in patterns that suggested meaning, suggested language, suggested things that Jorik's mind couldn't quite grasp, but felt hovering at the edge of comprehension. If he just looked a little longer, paid a little more attention, surely he could understand what they were trying to communicate. He forced himself to look away. Drem, still here. I need to tell you something. Then tell me. I'm thinking about drinking the condensation, the water on the walls. I know it's probably contaminated, I know it's probably what they want. But I'm so thirsty I can barely think, and dying of dehydration is going to take days, and I don't know if I can hold out that long." Drem didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was careful, measured. "You asking permission? Or telling me what you've already decided?" "I don't know. Both. Maybe. I need to say it out loud. Need someone to hear it. So if I do drink, if I transform, there's a witness. Someone who knows I tried to resist. Someone who knows I didn't want this. I'll witness it. And Jorik, if you drink, if you change, I'll kill you before you kill me. That's a promise. You won't die as one of them, confused and transformed. You'll die human, killed by a human for human reasons. That's the best I can offer." The promise should have been horrifying. Instead, it was a comfort, knowing that even if he failed, even if the thirst broke him, there would be consequences. There would be an end that preserved something of who he was. "Same for you," Jorik said. "If you break first, deal." They shook hands, their grips weak from dehydration and exhaustion, but the gesture was real. A contract between two men who had known each other for less than a day, but who understood each other completely, because they were facing the same choice, the same end, the same terrible clarity about what mattered in the final hours of existence. More time passed. Jorik lost track of how much. The twisted sky above didn't change in ways that marked the passage of hours. Day and night seemed to have lost meaning. There was only the cold, the thirst, the ache in his bones, and the sound of the corrupted city below. He thought about his life, 40 years compressed into a handful of memories that seemed worth preserving. His mother teaching him the workers' catechism, her voice gentle despite the harshness of the words. His first day at the manufactorum, the pride he'd felt at being assigned to bolt rifle assembly, a task that connected him, however, distantly to the Emperor's warriors. The time he'd met Helna's husband, had approved the marriage, had held their first child, and felt the weight of continuing generations. Small moments, brief flashes of something that might have been happiness, or at least contentment, in the grinding routine of lower Hab existence. Had it been enough? Had his life meant something? The question felt simultaneously crucial and irrelevant. Meaning was something assigned by external observers, by systems and structures that persisted beyond individual existence. But he was the only observer who mattered. Really, the only one who could judge whether Jorik Ven's existence had been worthwhile. "I think it was enough," he said aloud. "What was?" Drem's voice was barely a whisper now. "My life. It wasn't great. It wasn't what the ancient texts describe, back when humans supposedly lived in paradise. But it was mine. I did the work assigned to me. I cared for my family. I maintained my faith, even when it seemed arbitrary. And now, at the end, I'm choosing how I die. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. Because in 10,000 years of Imperial history, across 1,000,000 worlds and trillions of souls, that's all anyone gets. A life, a choice, and a death. The specifics vary, but the structure is the same. We're born into a system we didn't choose. We work at tasks we didn't select. We die in circumstances beyond our control. But in that narrow space between birth and death, we get to decide who we are. And you, Jorik Ven, decided to be human, even when it hurt, even when the alternative was tempting, even when nobody would ever know. That's not nothing. That's everything. The Vox casters crackled to life again, making them both jump despite their weakness. The voice that emerged was different now, less synthesized, more organic. It sounded almost sad. "You are dying," it said, and the words seemed to come from inside Jorik's head as much as from the speakers. Slowly, painfully, pointlessly. "I can feel your bodies shutting down, organs beginning to fail, consciousness fraying at the edges. This is what you choose. This suffering, this slow dissolution?" "Yes," Jorik said through cracked lips. "Why?" "Help me understand why you cling to this limited existence when something better is offered freely. What is it about your humanity that is worth dying for?" "It's mine." The words cost him tremendous effort, each syllable scraping against his throat. That's all. It's mine. Not better than what you're offering, maybe. Not more pleasant or more meaningful or more anything. Just mine. And you can't have it. You can offer, but you can't force. And I refuse. You refuse and you die. We transform and we live. How is your choice superior? It's not. Drem spoke now, his voice as rough as Jorik's. Not superior, just different. You live through transformation. We die maintaining form. Neither is better in any objective sense. But for us, for humans who were raised to believe that our individual existence matters, dying unchanged is preferable to living transformed. That's not logic. That's not reason. That's just how we're built. Then you are built wrong, and we are trying to fix you. We don't want to be fixed. That is the flaw. You don't know what you want. You've been conditioned by 10 millennia of imperial propaganda to fear the very things that would liberate you. We are not your enemy. We are your potential. And you choose to die rather than realize it because you've been taught that change equals corruption, that transformation equals death, that anything beyond your narrow parameters of acceptable existence is heretical. Maybe. Jorik's vision was blurring now, darkness creeping in from the edges. Maybe you're right. Maybe we are choosing death because we've been programmed to. Maybe if we'd been raised differently, taught differently, we'd welcome what you're offering. But we weren't. We are who we are because of our experiences, our conditioning, our choices within the limited options available to us. And you asking us to become something different, even something better, is asking us to stop being us. So we refuse. The voice fell silent. The vox casters crackled with static, then went dead. In the distance, Jorik could hear the city sounds changing, becoming more organized, more rhythmic. The transformation was completing itself. Tertius Prime was no longer an imperial world. It was something else now, something that wore the city's shape, but served different masters, operated on different principles, existed for different purposes. And on a service platform high on the hive's exterior, 2 men were dying because they refused to join it. Drem, still here. Barely. Thank you. For staying with me. For giving me someone to talk to at the end. I don't think I could have done this alone. Neither could I. Strange, isn't it? We spend our whole lives in the hive, surrounded by millions, but always isolated. Always separate. Takes the end of the world for 2 strangers to actually connect, actually understand each other. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that we're dying, but that it took dying to find real human connection. Or maybe that's the victory. That even at the end, even in the worst circumstances, we still found it. Still managed to be human together instead of suffering alone. Jorik's eyes were closing. He fought to keep them open, fought to stay conscious. But his body had reached its limits. 3 days without water, hours of cold exposure, the accumulated stress of witnessing his world's destruction. Everything was shutting down, systems failing in sequence, consciousness fading. His last clear thought was about the trigger mechanism, about how satisfying it had been when everything clicked into place. How that small satisfaction, repeated 10,000 times, had added up to something. Not a legacy, not glory, not recognition, just the quiet knowledge that he had done his work well, had maintained standards even when nobody was watching, had preserved his integrity in a universe that offered every reason to abandon it. That was enough. That had to be enough. He died still thinking about that click, that perfect moment of assembly, that proof that even in a grinding, brutal, existence there were small moments of rightness, of things fitting together as they should. Beside him, Drem lasted another 6 hours. He spent them in prayer, reciting every catechism he could remember, every hymn, every oath of loyalty. His voice faded to a whisper, then to breath shaped like words, then to nothing. But he kept moving his lips until the very end, until his heart finally stopped and his body went still on the cold metal platform. When the Imperium arrived 43 days later, they found the bodies uncorrupted. The commissar leading the purge stood over them for a long moment. He'd seen thousands of bodies in his years of service. Millions, perhaps. Most told stories of violent death, of panic, of suffering. These two told a different story. A story of choice, of resistance, of dying with dignity in circumstances that offered none. He drew his bolt pistol, following standing orders. No one who had been present during warp incursion could be trusted, regardless of how they had died. 2 rounds, precisely placed. Final mercy and necessary precaution combined. But before he left, before he ordered the entire platform sealed and burned, he made a note in his report. 2 words that would be filed in the vast archives of the Administratum, lost among trillions of similar reports from millions of similar worlds. They resisted. It was a small thing, a meaningless notation in the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium, but it was recorded, and recording mattered. Because, in a universe where individual suffering disappeared into statistical insignificance, where meaning existed only when witnessed, those 2 words were proof that Jorik Venn and Drem Coulter had existed, had chosen, had died as themselves. That was victory. Small, forgotten, insignificant, but victory nonetheless. In the cold mathematics of Imperial survival, that was enough. The Purge teams moved through Tertius Prime with methodical efficiency. They were soldiers of the Astra Militarum, veterans of a dozen campaigns, men and women who had learned to suppress the natural human reactions to horror and simply execute their orders. Behind them came the Adepta Sororatus, the Sisters of Battle, whose faith burned bright enough to push back the lingering warp taint that clung to every surface of the corrupted hive. Sergeant Cale Tornak had been part of Purge operations before. 3 times, across 3 different worlds. Each one had been different in the specifics, but identical in the fundamentals. A population corrupted by chaos. Infrastructure transformed beyond recognition. The lingering psychic stench of daemonic presence. And always, the bodies of those who had resisted. Section 12 clear. His Vox operator reported. 17 bodies recovered, all showing signs of warp transformation. Proceeding to incineration protocol. Copy that. Move to Section 13. Tornak checked his auspex, watching the green dots of his squad move through the 3-dimensional map of the hive. They'd been at this for 6 days now, methodically clearing level after level, burning everything that couldn't be salvaged, marking everything that could for later reclamation. Not that there would be much reclamation. Tertius Prime was scheduled for exterminatus once the purge was complete. Total planetary sterilization. Better to burn a world than risk a single strand of corruption spreading. Sergeant. The voice belonged to Corporal Meston, a young soldier on his first purge operation. I've got something here. 2 bodies on an external service platform. They're clean, sir. No visible corruption. Define clean. No mutations. No markings. No signs of warp taint at all. They look like they just died. Dehydration, probably. They're holding hands, sir. Tornach felt something twist in his chest. After 6 days of burning transformed corpses, of seeing what chaos did to human bodies and minds, finding uncorrupted remains was jarring. It raised questions. Questions about how they had survived. Questions about why they had chosen to die rather than drink. Questions that Tornak knew better than to dwell on, because dwelling led to doubt. Doubt was the first step toward corruption. Mark the location. I'll send the Commissar. Already here, Sergeant. Commissar Thrace's voice cut across the Vox channel, cold and absolutely certain. I've examined the bodies. They died resisting. Standard protocol applies. I'll handle the execution and disposal. Execution. That was the word they used for putting rounds into corpses that had already died, making absolutely certain that no trace of psychic contamination could persist beyond death. It was brutal. It was necessary. It was the price of survival in a galaxy where the dead could be as dangerous as the living. Tornak moved on to the next section, his mind already pushing away the image of 2 uncorrupted bodies holding hands. It didn't matter. Couldn't matter. They were just 2 among 17 million. and 17 million was just a number in the vast accounting of Imperial casualties. The Imperium measured its dead in populations, not individuals. That was how it survived, by treating tragedy on a scale so vast that individual suffering became meaningless. 3 levels down, in what had once been a residential hab block, Tornak's squad found something that made even veteran soldiers pause. A room full of children. Dozens of them arranged in a circle, all facing inward. Their bodies showed the telltale signs of transformation. Skin mottled with colors that shouldn't exist, features stretched and distorted. But their faces, those faces, still held enough humanity to be recognizable as young, as innocent, as things that should have been protected. Emperor's mercy, someone whispered. There is no mercy here. Tornak's voice was flat, empty of emotion, because emotion would break him. Just duty. Mark them for incineration and move on. They're children, Sergeant. They were children. Now they're vectors of corruption. You want to spare them. Spare the next world by making sure every trace of this is burned to ash. Tornak forced himself to look at the circle of small bodies, forced himself to acknowledge what he was ordering. The warp doesn't care about innocence, doesn't care about age or intent or anything else we use to define morality. It consumes everything it touches. These children are gone. What's left is just shells, and shells get burned. The squad moved on, leaving flamers to do the necessary work. Behind them, the hab block filled with fire, with smoke, with the smell of burning flesh that was simultaneously human and something else. Tornak breathed through his mouth, trying not to think about the fact that some of those children had probably been younger than his own daughter, back on his homeworld. Couldn't think about that. Couldn't make comparisons. Couldn't personalize. That way lay madness. In the lower manufactorum levels, they found the assembly lines still running. Servitors continued their endless work, their lobotomized brains unable to comprehend that there was no longer any reason to produce. Bolt rifle components moved along conveyor belts in neat rows, each one precisely manufactured, each one completely useless. The Imperium wouldn't accept ammunition from a tainted world. Everything produced here would be destroyed along with everything else. Waste of good materials, Meston said, watching a perfectly crafted trigger mechanism tumble into a sorting bin. Materials aren't the concern. Purity is. Tornak examined one of the components, noting the precision of its manufacture. Someone had taken pride in this work. Someone had spent years, maybe decades, perfecting the skill necessary to create parts this precise. And now it was all waste, all meaningless, because the world that produced them had fallen. He thought about the 2 bodies on the service platform, about workers who had fled the manufactorums when the corruption started, about the choice between continuing to produce in the face of madness or abandoning the only purpose their lives had known. Both choices led to death, but one preserved dignity, and maybe that was the only victory available. Mark the manufactorum for complete incineration, he ordered, including the servitors. We're not taking any chances with potential contamination. The servitors didn't react as the flamers moved into position. They continued their work right up until the moment the flames consumed them, their dead eyes fixed on assembly tasks that would never be completed. In their mechanical dedication, they were almost admirable, almost a symbol of what Imperial service should look like. Absolute obedience unto death and beyond. Almost. But servitors weren't human anymore. They were tools that wore human shapes. And watching them burn, Tornak found himself thinking about the difference between dying as a servitor and dying as a person. Both served the Imperium. Both contributed to humanity's survival. But one had made a choice, and one had been stripped of the capacity to choose. Which was better? Which death had more meaning? Dangerous questions. The kind that led to the sort of philosophical doubt that commissars put bullets in. Tornak pushed them away, focused on the tactical display, on the next section, the next level, the next set of coordinates that needed to be cleared and burned and marked as sterile. On the 7th day, they reached the gubernatorial palace. It sprawled across the upper levels of the hive, a structure that had once represented the peak of local authority, and now represented the heart of the corruption. The warp had concentrated here, had twisted the architecture into impossible geometries that made Tornak's eyes water when he tried to focus on them. "We're going to need the sisters for this," he reported to command. "Standard purge isn't sufficient. The taint here is too strong. Sisters are en route. Hold position and establish a perimeter." The Adepta Sororitas arrived in a transport that bore the symbols of the Order of the Bloody Rose. 20 sisters, each one clad in power armor that gleamed despite the ash that covered everything else on Tertius Prime. Their leader was a canoness whose face bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, whose eyes held the absolute certainty that only true faith could provide. Sergeant Tornak. Her voice was hard, precise. "Brief me on the situation. The palace is the epicenter of the corruption, canoness. We've cleared the surrounding levels, but the palace itself it's wrong. Architecture that shouldn't be possible. Sounds that aren't sounds. Several of my men have reported experiencing visions when they get too close. Then your men will remain here while my sisters cleans the interior. The Emperor protects the faithful, Sergeant. Your soldiers are brave, but they lack the spiritual armor necessary for what we will encounter inside." Tornak wanted to argue, wanted to insist that his soldiers were capable, that they'd faced horrors before, that they deserved to be part of completing this mission. But he'd worked with the sororitas before, knew that when they spoke of spiritual armor, they weren't being metaphorical. Some levels of corruption required more than guns and grenades. Required faith so absolute it could push back the Imperium itself. "Understood, Canoness. We'll secure the perimeter." He watched the sisters enter the palace, their armor gleaming in the red emergency lighting that still somehow functioned, despite everything else being corrupted. They moved with precision, with purpose, with the absolute confidence of women who knew they walked in the Emperor's light. Their hymns echoed through the Vox channels, prayers turned into weapons, faith given voice. Inside the palace, they found horrors. Tornak only learned the details later, reading the canoness's report while waiting for the exterminatus order. The staff had all transformed, their bodies merged in ways that defied anatomy. The governor himself had died in his chambers, apparently resisting until the end, his body unmarked by corruption, but clearly dead from dehydration. The astropathic spire had contained the burnt-out husk of an astropath who had sacrificed herself to send a warning into the void. Small resistances, small victories, small proofs that even in total corruption, some souls had chosen defiance. The sisters burned it all anyway, because the dead couldn't be trusted any more than the living, because warp taint could persist in bones and ashes and the very stones of the structure, because absolute purification was the only acceptable standard, sir. Meston approached as the palace burned behind them, flames visible from dozens of kilometers away. "Why do we do this? Not the purge, I understand the necessity of that. But why do we keep records? Why do we note who resisted and who didn't if we're just going to burn them all the same?" Tornak considered the question. It was a good one. A question that cut to the heart of what Imperial service meant. Because witness matters. Because if we don't record resistance, then from the Imperium's perspective, it didn't happen. And if it didn't happen, then there's no difference between worlds that fought and worlds that surrendered. No difference between dying human and dying corrupted. The record is all we have, Corporal. It's the only way to preserve meaning when everything else is reduced to ash. But no one reads the records. They're filed in archives that no one accesses. They might as well not exist. They exist. That's enough. Somewhere in the administratum. On some data slate in some vault on some world. There's a record that says Tertius Prime fell but some resisted. That record will outlast us. Will outlast everyone who fought here. Will outlast the memory of this world. And maybe, centuries from now, some clerk will access it. Some historian will study it. Some Imperial commander will read about how civilians died resisting rather than accept corruption, and that knowledge will matter. Will inform decisions. Will remind them that humanity is worth preserving because humans, even at the end, choose to remain human. Seems like a lot of faith to put in bureaucracy, sir. The Imperium is bureaucracy, Corporal. For every soldier on a battlefield, there are 1,000 clerks maintaining records. For every planet that burns, there are 1,000,000 data entries documenting why. We call it the administratum, but it's really the memory of the species. Inefficient, bloated, corrupt in its own ways, but ultimately the thing that ensures that humanity's experiences persist beyond individual lives. So yes, I have faith in bureaucracy, because the alternative is forgetting, and forgetting means that every death is truly meaningless. The exterminatus came on the 9th day. Tornak watched from orbit as the cyclonic torpedoes descended toward Tertius Prime. Watched as they impacted across the planet's surface in a carefully calculated pattern. Watched as the world began to burn. Atmosphere igniting, oceans boiling, continents cracking apart under the force of weapons designed to kill planets. It took 6 hours for the destruction to complete. 6 hours of watching a world die, of seeing 17 million deaths reduced to spreading patterns of fire and devastation. By the end, Tertius Prime was a blackened sphere, its surface temperature too high to support any form of life, its atmosphere stripped away, its corruption burned so thoroughly that not even ashes remained. All units, this is Fleet Command. Tertius Prime has been successfully sterilized. Purge teams are released from duty. Return to your transports for debriefing and reassignment. The Vox channel filled with acknowledgments, with the tired voices of soldiers who had spent 9 days burning a world and were ready to leave. Tornak added his own acknowledgement, then stood at the viewport a moment longer, looking at the dead world below. Somewhere on that world, in the ash and the fused glass and the superheated rock, were the remains of 2 men who had died holding hands on a service platform. Were the remains of children who had been transformed despite their innocence. Were the remains of a governor who had resisted in his chambers, and an astropath who had burned herself out sending a warning that arrived too late. All of them gone. All of them reduced to atoms. All of them erased from physical existence. But not forgotten. Not entirely. Because somewhere in the ship's data banks, in reports that would be transmitted back to Sector Command and filed in archives that stretched across light years, their stories persisted. Brief, clinical, stripped of emotion and reduced to tactical notations. But persistent, they resisted. Governor maintained faith until death. Astropath sacrificed herself attempting communication. Civilian casualties estimated at 17 million, including children. Small phrases. Simple statements. But statements that would outlast the world they described. That would persist in the vast memory of the Imperium, accessible to anyone with the clearance and the patience to dig through millennia of accumulated data. That was the truth that Tornak had learned across 3 purge operations, that the Imperium's real strength wasn't its weapons or its soldiers or even its faith. It was its bureaucracy, its obsessive, meticulous, maddening bureaucracy that recorded everything, that filed every report, that preserved every piece of data, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Because information persisted, because records mattered, because the dead could only truly die when they were forgotten, and the administratum forgot nothing. It was a cold comfort, a bureaucratic immortality that most citizens never knew existed, that offered no solace to those who suffered, that provided no practical benefit to the Imperium's operations. But it was something. A recognition that individual lives mattered enough to record, even if they didn't matter enough to save. The transport pulled away from Tertius Prime, carrying the purge teams back to the fleet. Behind them, the dead world continued to cool, continued its transformation from living planet to sterile monument. In a few decades, it would be safe to approach again. In a few centuries, the administratum might authorize resettlement, might establish new hives on the cooled surface, might begin the process of turning death back into life. But the Tertius Prime that had existed, the world of 17 million souls grinding through their daily existence in service to the Emperor, that world was gone, erased, reduced to data entries and fading memories. And on a service platform that no longer existed, two men had died choosing humanity over transformation, died knowing no one would remember, died believing it mattered anyway. In the cold equations of the Imperium's survival, they were right. It mattered. Not because it changed anything, not because it saved anyone, not because it would be remembered beyond the sterile notations in a report that few would ever read. It mattered because they had chosen. Because in a universe that offered every reason to surrender, to transform, to accept the promises of powers that whispered from beyond reality, they had said no, had died saying no, had maintained their humanity until the very end, even though maintaining it meant suffering, meant dying alone, meant being forgotten. That was the lesson of Tertius Prime. Not that resistance led to victory, not that faith guaranteed salvation, not that the Emperor protected those who remained loyal. The lesson was simpler, harsher, more honest than the platitudes of Imperial doctrine. Survival wasn't about winning, wasn't about being saved or remembered or rewarded. Survival was about choosing to remain yourself even when remaining yourself meant death. It was about dying human rather than living transformed. It was about the cold certainty that in a universe where everything conspired to unmake you, to strip away your identity and replace it with something else, refusing that fate was its own victory, small victory, meaningless victory, victory that changed nothing and saved no one, but victory nonetheless. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, where hope was a lie and mercy was weakness, that small, meaningless, forgotten victory was all anyone could hope for. It was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant extinction. The Imperium endured because billions of humans across millions of worlds made that same choice every day, chose humanity over transformation, chose suffering over submission, chose to die as themselves rather than live as something else. Most of them died forgotten. Most of their choices went unrecorded. Most of their resistance disappeared into the grinding machinery of galactic war without leaving a trace. But some, a tiny fraction, a statistical insignificance, left notations in reports, left evidence that they had existed, had chosen, had resisted. And those notations, accumulated across millennia, formed a record, a testament, a proof that humanity was worth preserving because humans, even at the absolute end, even when all hope was lost and all help had failed to arrive, still chose to be human. That was the truth of what civilians endured during a heresy, not heroism, not glory, not salvation or reward or recognition, just the slow, grinding, agonizing process of choosing humanity over and over until choosing was no longer possible, until death finally offered relief from the burden of existence. And then, if they were lucky, if they had been witnessed, if some bureaucrat took the time to make a notation, their choice was recorded. 2 words in a report that would be filed and forgotten. They resisted. 2 words that meant everything and nothing. 2 words that were both epitaph and victory. 2 words that Jorik Venn and Drem Coulter had earned through suffering, through refusal, through dying with dignity in circumstances that offered none. The transport jumped to warp, carrying the survivors away from Tertius Prime. Behind them, the dead world receded into the distance. Just another casualty in a war that had lasted 10,000 years and would last 10,000 more. In the ship's databanks, the reports were filed. In the administratum's vast archives, the information was recorded. In the cold machinery of imperial bureaucracy, the deaths of 17 million people were reduced to numbers and notations and brief, clinical descriptions of corruption and resistance. And somewhere in those archives, preserved for as long as the Imperium endured, two words remained. They resisted. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. It didn't change anything or save anyone or provide comfort to those who suffered. But it was true. And in a universe built on lies, on propaganda, on the suppression of uncomfortable truths in service to species survival, that small truth mattered. It had to matter. Because if it didn't, if individual resistance was truly meaningless, if choosing to die human rather than live transformed was just another form of defeat, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of the Imperium's brutal machinery, of the grinding oppression, of the absolute intolerance for deviation? The point was survival. But survival of what? Of human bodies, living and reproducing regardless of what inhabited them, or survival of humanity itself, of the thing that made humans more than just biological machines, the capacity for choice and dignity and resistance even in the face of inevitable defeat. The Imperium claimed to protect humanity, but what it really protected was the ability to choose humanity, the freedom to refuse transformation, to reject the promises of powers that offered everything and demanded only surrender in return. That freedom was limited, constrained, exercised only at the very end when all other options had been exhausted. But it was real. And Jorik Venn, a manufactorum worker who had spent 27 years assembling trigger mechanisms on the third level of an unremarkable hive on an insignificant world, had exercised that freedom, had chosen to die thirsty and cold and alone rather than accept the alternative, had died human. And in the cold equations of the Imperium's survival, that was victory enough.